you all so much for joining. We're really excited to have you today. We have a little bit of an exercise later, and I can't wait to see how you all help us shape our direction here today. I'm going to first turn it over to Shayna to give us a quick introduction and kind of share why they're pursuing this study, and then we'll dive into what we've been up to, catch you up to date from the last workshop, and share the decisions we're working through and what's to come.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shayna Pollock. I manage the transportation program here at Central Atlanta Progress. As Lauren said, this is the second of 3 workshops that we're doing as part of our Curbside Management Action Plan. It's a document and real strategy and action plan that we're producing in partnership with Midtown Alliance and with funding through the Atlanta Regional Commission that's really aimed at creating an implementable strategy for managing the curb throughout both Midtown and downtown. As we all know and have continued to see through COVID, there is a lot of demand for curbside space due to deliveries, the need for people at the space to walk, to use the sidewalk, to have bike lanes there, bus lanes, deliveries, etc. And so we're using this study process to help us to better organize and manage that curb and to create a long-term strategy to help us determine what the highest and best uses are for each of the curbs in Midtown, and to kind of create a blueprint for the future. So thank you for joining us today. I'm always available if you have any questions. I'll drop my email in the chat. If you don't have it, feel free to reach out. But thanks for participating, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the meeting. Oh, and I think I had a few housekeeping things I was supposed to say. So basically the same thing we've all been saying on Zoom for 1.5 years now. Remember to mute yourself. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat box. And hopefully that was it. Someone will tell me if not.
I think that would cover it.
Great.
One quick notice, sorry, this is Matt. The meeting is being recorded. You probably all received a notification. We will be posting it later. Just wanted to make sure everyone knows it is being recorded.
Great. So we are going to stay in this main room for a little bit, and then toward the latter half of our time together, we are going to engage in some breakout rooms and talk more about different curb allocations. So I'm Lauren Matern. I'm with Nelson Nygaard. My colleagues Evan, Jason, and Carmen are in the room as well, and then Matt and Jody from Urban Trans, and we've been supporting on this effort and really happy to be doing so. And throughout all of this, I think trying to bring a people first view to how the curbs can and should operate, and that can mean a lot of different things. So we're excited to dig into the details today with y'all. So Shayna mentioned that this project was initiated to rethink how curbs can best meet the needs of the 2 districts, the needs of the city, and to create a roadmap that's very actionable, that slowly gets us there. So it'll deal with things like curb allocation and also how space is managed. So kind of the full gamut. And really happy to have you all here today because, as you know, the curb is, can sound a little bit dry as a topic, but it really touches a lot of different modes. It's the front door to a lot of different places. And so it is actually a really important topic to discuss with y'all. And so these are some of the order of operations for how we're pursuing this project. We started with some existing conditions work, just trying to understand, with really digging into the data on how the curbs are regulated today. That was really the subject of our last workshop. And so that kind of contains some pretty action-packed run through of a lot of findings. And then starting toward the beginning, starting with the first workshop and continuing today, we've been keeping an eye on understanding the conflicts, and then getting stakeholder feedback, including today, is just really important to us. And we've been including touch points throughout. And then where we hope to end up is putting together a really clear set of goals and policies that helps shape how to manage the curb in the future, that is holistic, that thinks about all the modes, and that is can set up some pilots, but also just some good policy work moving forward. And so that's how we've been pursuing our work. As you can see, we're about 3/4 of the way through, wrapping up this fall, wrapping up by the end of the year. And we've been at the stage of dealing with curb topologies, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but that's what really we're focused on at this juncture of the project. And that's what we want to talk with you about today. And we will get there in a minute. We want to, we care so much about managing the curb because it deals with so many things that we care about. How we manage it shapes a lot of our transportation outcomes, and it shapes a lot of our experiences navigating city streets. And it has some pretty big challenges, but also some really big opportunities for innovation, small and large. So today I'm just going to give a little bit of background on why we are thinking about the curb, how we're thinking about it. I'm going to go through that pretty quickly because we did cover it in the last workshop. And I see a couple repeat faces. I see a few newcomers. So I'll give a quick recap and then I'll turn it over to Evan to talk through the topology work that we're in the middle of now. So we are thinking about the curb because everyone has a stake in the curb. It it kind of has gone under-examined historically, not just in Atlanta, but in a lot of places. And we know that addressing it holistically can really do a lot to move the needle on our broader community goals, whether that's economic stimulation on some blocks, which is really more important than ever post-COVID, meeting our mode share goals, improving access for a broader range of people who have been typically accommodated at the curb, et cetera, et cetera. So it really can accommodate a lot if we think about it like that. It hasn't necessarily always played all of these roles, but it really can and should. It is the kind of operating system for a lot of the transportation networks that we need to work well for more people. So we need it to play a role in connecting for these systems. It's a really big resource. It covers a lot of literal mileage. And so managing it right has a really big sort of network effect. And then I think you all have seen in your own worlds that there's been a growing number of demands at the curb, and that's occurring against a backdrop of being pretty dedicated to vehicle infrastructure, whether that's a moving lane or a parking lane. So we want to look at it with an eye toward our overall goals. These are some of the objectives that were identified earlier on in the project. We want to make sure that the curbs keep access and equity in mind, that it's clear how they're used and why, that the value of them is coming through. It's going to be really important on the back end for everything for this project to provide clear direction for making decisions. I know that so many of decision makers, so many of you in the room would like to make more consistent policy-oriented curb decisions, and so we want to build that into the project. And then we want to make sure that it's really clear, provides clear direction, but also is adaptable, because a lot of things can change, whether it's a street redesign, a reprioritization, or a new mode that suddenly takes us by surprise. And it's quite striking to think about how the curb is allocated and how that matches overall goals. So right now, the vast majority of our curbs are used for private vehicles, so pretty low person throughput mode. And there is not a great curb accessibility in downtown and Midtown for other modes, although there have been quite a few projects that have started to reallocate curb. And if you kind of compare that on the next slide to where we want to be, so thinking about our mode split goals from the Transportation Master Plan, you would start to get a really different picture for how you would allocate curb to match those goals. So we do want to think about where we want to be going, if our curb allocation, our management systems are getting us there, and if not, what we should think about to reallocate and tune them up to better meet our goals overall. So that's some of the background shaping as we approach this project. I'm not going to recap all of the existing conditions work that we reviewed at the last workshop, but it was pretty interesting. One thing that's super unique context is that so much of the curb, as we think of it, actually has no parking today. It's comprised of a lot of different other uses. And so that does bring an interesting angle as we're thinking about reallocating space. It gets further into more sort of street movement issues. So the vast majority of curbs in downtown and midtown do not allow parking or other curbside uses. So about half of that excuse me, is curb cuts. There's also no parking, there's travel lanes. So we're starting from a place where a lot of the curb isn't quite usable for meaningful access today, but that's not to say that it's not up for discussion as part of the study. And this slide shows a little bit of a snapshot of some of the things that comprise the no parking category that I showed on the previous slide. So, no parking is a pretty diverse set of curb uses in itself. So that's some of the context in which we're reviewing how to rethink curb allocation and management. And then throughout the project, both including our own analysis, but also largely from outreach touch points, we have been asking and inquiring ourselves about which corridors have the biggest curbside demand management challenges, where people are frustrated. And so we've been keeping tabs on that list. It's a fairly organic list, and it's shown here on this, this map to the right, sort of a dynamic Google map. And as we've been thinking about how to reallocate curb space and a framework for rethinking how to change how curbs are used, we're kind of revisiting back to this map quite a bit and thinking about, does it match areas where people are saying they've experienced a lot of frustration, whether that is, the bike lane getting blocked by a truck, or not enough loading zones, or some kind of other friction between modes typically. So that brings us to what we've been up to most recently, which is setting up a framework for making decisions about how to allocate curb space. So we're referring to it as kind of curb topologies. And I'm going to turn it over to Evan to talk through how we're approaching that portion of the project.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and hello, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces. So, based on where we're at today in downtown and midtown, what's our approach moving forward? It's really kind of twofold. One is to acknowledge that there's a little bit of inefficiency on the curb, there's a little bit of imbalance, and there's a little bit of unequal access to the curb. And then provide a framework that actually illustrates how uses can be prioritized for each curb space in the study area. What's happening today, most blocks in downtown and midtown, they have curbs that are disorganized, a little bit undermanaged, and in many ways, curbs are regulated based on the needs of the past, unfortunately. So, on many streets, curbs do tend to maximize space for car movement. It means that most of downtown and midtown curbs prioritize the movement of vehicles instead of person movement, access, and loading. In the future, what we want to see with curb spaces is that we want to see spaces that are regulated, they're designed and operated to actually meet the real needs of people that use the curb. And then also the shifting demands of each street. So the hope is that the most critical curb functions on any given block are accommodated with curb space, appropriate regulation, and then infrastructure to actually support those priority uses. Some of the newer priorities that we're looking at is dedicated transit lanes, bike lanes along the curb, dedicated loading spaces for ride hailing and for delivery services, and then even more space for sidewalk cafes. Next slide. So what are the fundamental problem statements that we're solving for? It really boils down to two things. One is that we need to address the changing ways that people are actually using the curb. And where there are competing demands, we need a clear framework to actually determine which curb uses are highest and best use. And I love that use of the word, Shane, at the beginning of the session. Secondly, we need to acknowledge that curbs in downtown and Midtown are truly workhorses. There's a lot of action happening on the curb, but they just can't do it all, right? So, if we continue to treat curbs as if they can be everything to every user, they are going to continue to underperform, and competing demands will continue to be very challenging to actually address and manage. Next slide. And so the tool that we're going to be using to align each curb in the study area with priority functions is a curb typology. What is a curb typology? It's a very wonky term, but essentially it's a framework to help make decisions on how to prioritize Atlanta's curbs. It provides some guidance on priority curb functions, and then alongside that, what are the associated design, use and time regulations, and then operational needs for each curb function. Next slide. The typology is it's a guiding framework. It's going to be useful for actually calibrating curb functions to the current and future conditions of the street, and as well as the adjacent buildings and land uses. A typology typically establishes curb use priorities for each curb type based on a number of different factors. That includes land uses, which streets are slated to have priority transit and bike lanes, street geometry, and then it also factors in current unmet needs of local stakeholders. I will also note that the curb typology, we focus on the now for sure, but we're also focusing on future growth, new development, and then kind of rapidly changing curb demands based on new technology and customer preferences. Next slide. The curb typology, it's comprised of three basic elements. One is a map. The map assigns one of 6 curb types to every single curb on every block in the study area. And so when you look at the map, you're going to be able to understand whether a block is intended to provide more passenger and delivery service access on a curb versus maybe moving people on a curb. The second element is guidance on land use factors, development directions, street characteristics that guide curb use priorities. And then finally, the typology illustrates a range of design treatments that are appropriate for the priority curb spaces. So that could be, parklets, outdoor dining, bike lanes, lit lanes, loading zones, or even like a parking stall. So how is the curb typology actually going to be used? The map is essentially your legend to actually understand the initial design and regulatory direction for each curb on each block. You're then going to actually check the type designation on the map to understand each curb's type and associated guidance for design and operation. And then there's a bit of a planning and decision-making process that you need to go through to actually refine the appropriate design treatments that are necessary for each curb space or block base, the regulations that are needed, and then any special access features that might be needed for the curb. And then finally, the curb typology is going to be refined, and it needs to be really flexible. Changing demands are happening all the time. And look at just what happened during COVID. We have a bunch of new temporary spaces for sidewalks. And so some of those are going to be extended permanently. Some of them will be temporary. So you just need to have a little bit of flexibility built into the typology. And then a final note on the typology, one of the important factors of planning and deciding what's the appropriate use on the curb is to think of the network needs for general purpose traffic, for transit, for people walking, biking, and rolling. Atlanta currently doesn't have a comprehensive master plan for modal priorities on all of its streets. Kind of what we're doing with the curb typology is we're going to make sure that it actually accounts for the network requirements of each corridor and what that means for dedicated facilities for things like transit, micromobility, cars, even extended sidewalks. So that's a general summary of the typology. Going to hand it over to Jason to really dive into the componentry of the typology.
All right, thanks so much, Evan and Lauren, for going through all that content, and for everyone here. We know that there's a lot to take in. I'm going to try to be pretty careful to explain exactly how all this works. And just a reminder, we're going to go through an exercise as well, which is going to give you a chance to actually use some of this stuff in a hands-on way on some example streets that we pulled out. So I'll talk a little bit about what you can see on this slide here. This is the curb typology guide that we've created for downtown and Midtown Atlanta. And I'll talk about the different content on this page. So on the left-hand side, you can see the 6 different curb types that we have identified that we believe cover all of the different primary types of curbs in the study area. I'm going to show some examples of each of those in a second, but let's just talk about the commercial centers first as an example. So commercial centers, we can see in the middle area here, the land use and other contextual factors that would lead us to decide that a certain curb is a commercial center curb. So in this case, commercial centers, typically they have high density office, high density commercial and ground floor retail space, a little bit of residential, and probably access to off-street parking lots and garages, and potentially transit access as well. And then a lot of the loading space for commercial centers actually takes place on cross streets. So those are just some of the high level characteristics of that street type. You can see we have those characteristics for all 6. And I'll just hold off on talking about those until we actually get to the specific examples themselves. But you can see some of the things that go into how we actually define each of these types of curbs. And then on the right-hand side, this is really where we are prioritizing what uses go with each of these curb types. So these are in rank order from 1 to 5, with the number 1 priority being, of course, the most important, the one you want to start with when you're redesigning how you regulate your curb. So just talking about commercial centers, you can see the number 1 priority for those streets is people and green space. And in just a second, I'll talk about what that designation means. But people and green space, things like sidewalks, dining areas, that sort of thing, that's your number 1 priority there. Number 2 is mobility space. So that could mean really anything that is focused on moving people through a street, whether it's lanes for cars, lanes for bikes, bus lanes, anything about moving people. That's your number 2 priority for commercial centers. And then you can see the other priorities here as well: passenger access, delivery access, and then storage, those being a little bit less important specifically for the commercial centers. So you can see we've used the same consistent 5 curb priorities for each of these 6 curb types. And I'll go through some examples and talk about exactly how we landed on those priorities and what that would look like for each type. So along with the types themselves, we can see that under each of the 5 curb use priorities, there are a variety of different specific uses or design treatments associated with those. So these are those 5 different priority types across the top: people space, mobility space, passenger access space, delivery access space, and storage space. The uses that are underneath each of those are not in rank order, right? So if we're saying that people space is the highest priority on a certain curb, that could mean we need pedestrian walkways. It could mean we want parklets. It could mean we need more outdoor dining. All of that needs to be determined through the planning process that you would undertake when redesigning a specific curb. But what we're giving you here is really a menu of options and things that you want to consider underneath each of these main curb use priorities. So I'll go through some examples now and give at least one example of each street type, just so we can think about how this all comes together on actual Atlanta downtown and Midtown streets. So we'll talk about the commercial centers first. The image you're seeing here is Peachtree Street at Harris Street. So we definitely believe that this area qualifies as a commercial center. It's got a lot of office and high intensity commercial use. It's also moving a lot of cars, a lot of other types of vehicles, bikes, other things as well. So in this case, people space is our #1 priority, right? You can see we have pretty wide sidewalks. We know that there's going to be a lot of people working in this area, visiting this area. We want to make sure they're comfortable walking around, moving around in the neighborhood, and maybe even lingering on the street. And then #2 is our mobility space. So that could mean car lanes, bus lanes, bike lanes. In this case, right now, the street is really being used primarily for cars. But depending on the needs in that specific area, any type of mobility could be very important. If you know that Peachtree Street has a lot of high ridership transit activity, for example, you would want to potentially consider a transit priority treatment, something like that. So that's an example of a commercial center. Entertainment centers, those are in a lot of ways very similar. So this is West Peachtree Street at Peachtree Place up in Midtown. You can see, again, people space and green space is the #1 priority. There's a lot of popular restaurants, bars in this area. Lots of people want to come to this area and spend some time. So we want to make sure we're accommodating them. And then we have passenger access space at #2. And what we mean by that is space for people sort of arriving at this area, most likely by vehicle, to access the curb. So something like, for example, a passenger loading area for cars, for Uber, for Lyft, taxis, maybe a valet parking and loading area, something like that. Because as we know, when people are coming to an entertainment area, they're often arriving by some type of ride hail or taxi. Another street here, these are our commercial mobility corridors. These streets are really focused on moving people through the street. So they're less about access and more about how many people do we need to move through the street. This is Piedmont Avenue at Andrew Young Boulevard, mobility space, definitely our #1 priority. You can see right now, the street has 4 travel lanes for cars. But again, mobility space doesn't just have to be for cars. It could be for buses, it could be for bikes or any other type of movement through the street. So if you know that there's demand here, for example, for bicycle and scooter activity, you could certainly consider taking one of these lanes to use for something like a cycle track. Now we have our neighborhood mobility corridors. Right now we're looking at Piedmont Avenue at 4th Street. So again, Piedmont Avenue, but now further north. You can see this is a much more residential area, and that's what differentiates it as a neighborhood mobility corridor. So again, mobility space is your top priority. And right now you can see, again, plenty of travel space for cars, not so much for other modes. The main difference here between other types of mobility corridors is you also potentially want to provide some on-street storage space. Again, residential area, people need a place to keep their vehicles on street. So that becomes a somewhat higher priority here. And then we have our people streets. And this is perhaps one of the most important types of streets that we see in downtown and Midtown Atlanta. Here's an example of Pryor Street. These are your smaller streets. They're cross streets to some of those bigger streets we talked about. You definitely want to make sure you're providing your people space, safe walkways, but also you need delivery access space. So these streets, again, cross streets to some of those bigger ones, are really where you want to concentrate that freight loading and make sure that that's taken off some of the busier streets. Here's another example in Midtown. This is Cypress Street. You can see similar, it's a much narrower, smaller street. We want to make sure we have that good pedestrian access with the sidewalks given the residential in the area, but definitely want to provide that delivery access space as well. And then here's another one. This is very small, almost what we would consider an alleyway. This is Fairley Street. And again, we need that pedestrian access to make sure we have a connected pedestrian network, but definitely we would see a street like this as a good place to handle that delivery access and maybe some vehicle storage as well. And then finally, this is our last street type. I know this is a lot to take in. We're going to talk more about our neighborhood avenues during our exercise together. This is Edgewood Avenue. So this street type is actually a little bit less common in downtown and Midtown, but it's something that we think is very important to the city of Atlanta overall. I think another example outside of our current study area would be something like, say, Highland Avenue. But these are streets that are a little bit smaller, more of a neighborhood feel, but there's a lot of activity. There's popular restaurants and bars, popular places to hang out. We know people want to arrive by a lot of different modes. People may need to take transit, they may want to bike, they may want to drive or be dropped off by a taxi, something like that. And what you're seeing on Edgewood here is an attempt to really handle all of those different uses in one place. So these are pretty complex, and we'll talk about these together more. And that brings us to our next steps as we start to wrap up our presentation here. We're going to share a few examples of curbs from other cities, just to get us all thinking about some of the strategies we might want to employ to improve how Atlanta's curbs are working. And when we get into our exercise, we can think back to these and think about if any of these lessons learned are applicable to us. Here's an example from Portland. One issue we know we experience in Atlanta is that loading vehicles, whether it's buses or trucks, often conflict with bikes at the curbside and scooters. So in Portland, something they're employing is a bus loading pad that is actually, here on the left-hand side of this bike lane. The bus loading takes place out in the street. There's no chance for a conflict between the buses and the bikes at this location. Here's another similar example, again, separating loading vehicles from bikes. This is in Seattle. But rather than buses, this is actually something that your taxis and your Uber and your Lyft, passengers using those actually have a dedicated place to stand and wait and load rather than standing, for example, in the bike lane. Here's an example of another issue that we've identified in Atlanta. We've noticed that scooters and bikes sometimes are cluttering certain areas on the sidewalk. A good way to deal with that is what they're doing in Santa Monica. They are actually marking specific designated scooter parking areas that kind of, again, keeps those uses separated and a little bit easier to manage. Here's an example from Chicago. So again, loading trucks. Right now, that activity is kind of happening in a little bit of a disorganized way. Here's an example of how to make sure that those loading trucks are not creating a safety hazard for bikes that are operating on the same street. And then finally, here's an example from San Francisco. Really what we're looking at here is the signage and how clear it is that these areas are specifically for loading. And another interesting feature here is that they're actually pricing these areas. You don't only have to price parking, you can actually price loading areas as well. But again, it's important to think about really clearly marking where your loading should take place versus other types of parking. So that really does it for our presentation today. As we move forward with the project, we are going to finalize this curb typology with your input. So really looking forward to hearing from you all today. And then we'll be synthesizing some recommendations from that feedback that we get and developing that final curb strategy, which we will bring back to all of you at a final public workshop. And with that, I think we can get into a question and answer period.
Great. And Jason, while you were presenting a few good questions and also just some discussion in general popped up in the chat. So there's some questions about the definition of freight and presumably the definition of what would go in delivery zones. So that was a question, but I think there might be a little feedback in there too. And then a lot of notes about kind of the location, siting, friction around delivery. So a lot of feedback there. And that's just, reinforcing the point, I think, that about how important it is to get some of the details right around loading zones, not just the designation, but also the location and design features around other elements of our curb users. Is there any other, I think a lot of it is kind of good food for thought for us, but are there any other questions embedded within that discussion that folks want to bring up? Yeah, a lot of coordination. Okay.
Is this the time we can speak?
Yes, yes, I'm so sorry. You can either chat or speak. Yeah.
Okay.
So happy to answer any questions on that or any other topics.
Yes, thank you. I'm Debbie Wren and I live at 1421 Peachtree Street, which is more upper Midtown. I'm not sure if I saw it on your map. I saw that purple line for that zone and I would love to see that extended to include, I don't know if you already have limits on the scope or the area of this study, but we live north of 17th Street on Peachtree Street, and there are traffic lanes in front of our condominium right now, and we use it for loading, but I'm concerned that what is the plan for the future going forward to help create a safer, yeah, it looks like your map goes this far up. Yes, good, good, wonderful. Yeah, there was, so in any case, and the challenge for us, just specifically to focus on we're an older building. It was an office building that was converted into condominiums in the 1980s, and it does not have a loading dock. So whenever a resident wants to renovate their unit or someone moves in or moves out, there are always challenges with where to park, where to load, where to pick up delivery, that type of thing. And we can't just, I mean, I understand plans start with the ideal and work to the detail. I just hope we can't move this function off of Peachtree Street because we're in the middle of the block and we have a narrow alley behind us that I understand is owned by each property owner. There's no designated public alley. So I don't know if y'all are aware of that situation in Atlanta. But these are just to bring this to your attention and a call for help with keeping a safe, functional delivery, loading, drop off, accessibility to buildings in the middle of the block who can't move those functions off to side streets. We're on Peachtree Street. So thank you.
Hey, may I ask a question? Great. Is part of the outcome of this also going to think about really the temporal, like different times, different days? Because obviously, unfortunately, so much emphasis is based on commuter traffic, and I think some of these solutions that almost make me feel like the non-drivers are picking up the scraps left over by roadway capacity. So I'd love to hear how that kind of thinking will be incorporated.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it's a really important concept. I think we're also trying to be realistic about what can change during the day. So I see a lot of kind of curb schemes that swap in. Suddenly a parklet appears at noon, which of course isn't realistic, just given the ruggedness of streets and the operating system of them. But yes, I think temporal needs to be a huge factor. I've seen some practices where cities are kind of trying to group and cluster different uses that won't cause friction when they change, but that do allow it to shift. So goods loading switching to passenger loading. We're seeing cities expand the definitions of some of these, given that there are new types of pressures. And then people in the chat are also mentioning universal pressures around, just move in, move out, and what category does that fall into? So I think that's a good question to around expanding what those mean and how they can be useful to different people. But yeah, I would really like to include temporal changes, and we want to make sure the way we suggest it is implementable as well.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Susan Shapiro and I live in Midtown. I'm right at the corner of Peachtree and Linden. I was in a conversation with a dear friend of mine recently, and she knew nothing about this project and had some complaints about some streets which are immaterial to the question. I think it's going to be really important that your work get communicated widely, and that you continue to keep your ears open, because obviously what works, somebody will be mad at you, no matter what you come up with. But I think, you know, a good communication plan is going to be really important.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, Matt can share a little bit about how we're working through this project itself, but then also in the strategy, we know that there are some decisions that are more straightforward and some that require more feedback. So we're noting which ones need more discussion and vetting, even while we're giving, you know, some ideas and direction, but not sort of the final word. I think that's important to also remember. Matt, can you just give a quick overview of what's coming with this project in terms of communicating it? And I think that could be useful for folks to keep their eye on. And then if there's other friends they want to invite to the last workshop, or any place they should keep their eye for further input on this process itself.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat about that. So there's a couple different things going on. In the chat, Lauren linked already to the Central Atlanta Progress website. Midtown Alliance is also keeping a web page with similar information about the project, and I will post that into the chat for people. And what you can find at those sites are an overview of the project study. You can also see slides and a video recording from our last workshop. We'll be posting a video recording from this workshop along with the slides from this workshop to both of those sites. You know, we just acknowledged, you know, we picked this time hoping it would work for the most people, but we realize it doesn't work for everyone. So if you do know people who would like to get a better understanding of what we're doing, please invite them to go there, watch the recordings or review the information. And there's opportunities on those pages to submit information to us and feedback. And then we'll of course be having a third workshop. We're making sure that we're notifying everyone who's attended either the workshop 2 or 3, 1 or 2 to the third workshop when that will be coming up. And we're also focusing on social media to keep information. And if you are subscribed to either one of the Midtown or Central Atlanta Progress ADID newsletters, we're getting information posted into those. So it's a handful of ways to keep on top of the project, and hopefully we're able to capture a lot of people through those processes. I'll hand it back.
I've got one interjection. I'm curious as to how most folks found their way to the meeting. I know that this is not a particularly sexy topic, but as Lauren aptly described, it really is the operating system of our city. So if you could just put in the chat how you came about learning about this project, that would be really helpful for our outreach efforts to make sure that we're capturing the broadest spectrum of stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I'd be curious to see that too. I'm also I got one direct message that I think was meant for the group, and it echoes Jennifer's question to the broader group too, just around how the demonstration project on Peachtree, near Peachtree Center fits in. How does it relate to the topologies? Are we involved in that? So that is a different project outside of the realm of this project, but we are absolutely watching it with great interest because there's a lot to be learned from it. I think Jennifer's making that point as well, that it gets into like how enforceable are things, what friction will appear, how's the user experience of reallocating space. yeah, so we want to learn from that. And we're talking today a lot about curb allocation, but there's also a lot of management detail that will fit into the broader strategy that we want to flush out. And I think the Peachtree example can help us identify where things can, what recommendations we can tune up based on that experience. And then I think I'll take one more question, and then I do want to switch to the breakout groups because I think that'll be valuable for you and for us as well. So Robin, did you want to ask the last question?
Sure. I don't know if it was covered before because I joined late and I put it in the chat, but I've thought about putting up signage for where people can deliver stuff, create some sort of standard like they did for parking a couple of years ago where they had that contest. So people can be directed for each building where those deliveries are. Because I know I have a lot of deliveries that come here. People don't want to park on Peachtree, especially between 6th and 7th where it's busy. So they spend about a half hour. And just last week, I spent 15 minutes on the phone with an Instacart person, first time they were delivering to my building, in order to direct them on where to go.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I agree that there are a lot of curb uses where just the experience and some of the anxiety around if you're following the rules, where you can be, what the outcome will be if you're breaking it, aren't quite clear. And yeah, as kind of curb pressures have diversified in recent years, there's all kinds of new ones as well. A lot of questions about how they fit in that are further complicating that. So I really like that suggestion around just the signage and clarity and kind of giving you that ease of mind about where to be.
Because that could create a lot of flexibility for each building on the best solution for each location. And then we don't have to worry about standardizing every single place where it physically won't work, but by making standard signs throughout the city or throughout our districts, then that becomes something delivery drivers can depend upon and don't have to drive around a block 5 times because there'll be signage to direct them for each location. And if we create it with the building name, locations that look common, and then around with directions, that may be able to simplify this whole process, as well as reduce the stress of the delivery drivers and the want to stop in places which may get their cars stolen or their cars broken into or impact traffic because of their frustration of not being able to find where it needs to go.
Yeah, that anxiety is one of my least favorite things about using the curb, and I like your suggestions. I think I'll turn it over to Matt to switch to breakout groups so that we leave a little time for that. Definitely don't hesitate to drop more questions in the chat though. We can always follow up after. But Matt, if you want to get us oriented on the breakout rooms, that would be great.
Great. I'm going to share my screen here with everyone. One moment. Okay, so in this next stop or portion of the workshop, we want to hear, really directly from you and also give you an opportunity to really dig into a specific typology. So what we've done is we are going to assign you to different groups, and that's going to happen automatically. I've been working on that in the background. Each group is going to have a facilitator, and we're going to be utilizing a tool called Miro. You will have a link to it. It's a web application, so you'll be able to click on it. At the same time, your facilitator is going to be sharing their screen. So if you can't get to the Miro board on your own computer, no problem. The screen's going to be shared. But it's made up of 3 steps of what we're going to do. And when you click that link, you're going to arrive to something that looks like what I'm showing right here. And I'm going to walk through a little bit of the features of how to use the tool and also what we're going to be asking you to do. So there's a lot of information when you go to these screens, so sometimes it's a little bit hard to read. And there's different things you can do to improve that, and also easier ways to move around. So when you get here in the lower right portion of your screen, you're probably going to see something like this. It shows you kind of the content of what's on this board, the Miro board that we have. For me, it's kind of a distraction. And so I usually like to click on this unpin map button, and that'll go away and off it gets. But you can zoom in and out here. So on your screen, if you want to see things a little better, zoom in, zoom out. So you can do that. Now, on the first step in the project, what we're going to do is we've just pulled information from the presentation about the typology that we'd like you to look at. So what you see here is an example with entertainment centers. And you see the information that Jason talked about during the presentation. You can see the prioritization of the curb, and you can see definitions of those prioritizations and all the attributes that are associated with them. And this is just to kind of give you some information to work with as we go through the exercise, because we're going to ask you to really explore this typology and think about how it works and what you like about it and what you might see improved. So this is step one. Just please take a look at this. Now to move around in the board, in your lower right, you'll have these, or excuse me, lower left, you'll have these little arrows. You can click on them and up come some windows. And we want to look at frames. That makes things just a little easier in my opinion. And now you can see the different steps for the project. So we're going to move to step 2 and just click on that button. And up comes the window for step 2. Now, if this is too small for you, you can hide the frames by clicking up on the X. You can always bring them back again by going down into the lower left corner. And you can play around with the zoom. So what we'd like you to do on this step is actually apply the typology. So utilizing the guidance from the typology, how would you use the curb? And what we've created for you is just kind of a sample street, kind of a view for you to look at, mostly blank. And then we've added a few icons over here on the left that you can utilize to fill in how you would use the curb. Now, if you notice, when I got to my Miro board, I had a little hand is what's showing. You can't really select anything with the hand. You need to use the pointer. But your facilitator will be helping with this exercise, so they'll be able to do a lot of the work for you. But let's say, okay, I think there should be a bike lane over on this curb. You can add it. Or maybe you want a transit lane, bus lane, separating that. Maybe you want some freight loading, put it over here. We're only doing one icon on things, so just to keep things a little bit clean. But if you want to create new icons, it's just a simple copy and paste like you would in Word. So Control C, Control V. Now you suddenly have two things. Now, these are the things we were thinking about that you'd probably want to use, but maybe we are missing something. Maybe there's a use on the curb that you think needs to be addressed. So we've created some little sticky notes. You can double click in these sticky notes and just write in what you think is missing, and then click out of it, and you can drag the sticky note just like I was dragging everything else. So I'm working in someone's board, so I'm going to reverse all these edits I made so that when they get there. Now, I don't want you to get too focused in on this exercise. The goal here is not for you to perfectly design a curb. It's for you to just kind of think through the typology and think about how it might be applied. What we're really most interested in is this next step, step 3. So don't get too bogged down in step 2. It's just kind of a quick way for you to kind of think through how the typology might get applied. What we really want to hear from you is, based on that, how's the typology working? So we've created this third frame, and we want to hear from you using these little sticky notes. What are things you like about the typology? What's working well? What do you want to make sure doesn't change? But then maybe there's some things you think are missing. Excuse me. So that's where you can use the things you'd like to change. So maybe the prioritizations don't seem right to you. Maybe you want to tell us, you know, I think passenger access should be before people in green space or something else down the line. Maybe you feel like there's a prioritization that's missing that should have been in there. Or perhaps you think certain prioritizations should be broken out into additional prioritizations. And then we have these attributes. Are there certain attributes that you think are potentially missing that needed to be added? Are there things about the typology that doesn't make sense to you or are causing confusion? It's really open. We're looking for you to kind of just tell us what that is. So for the sticky notes, like I said, you can double click, type things in, put some notes in there for us. And then ideally, take the sticky note to where the section is on the typology that you're talking about. And we're going to use these sticky notes to really understand and create the notes from the meetings. The more detail you can provide, the better. The text is going to get a little small. You can always use the zoom button to kind of zoom in. But so the next step we're going to do is I'm going to automatically move you into some breakout groups. Like I said, there's going to be a facilitator in each one of those groups. And that facilitator will post a link to your group's specific board in the chat so that you can all join it. There will be someone who's going to remain in the main meeting room. So if you have any questions, you can come back to the main meeting room and there's someone there to help you. And we're going to end the session with the breakouts. So once your group's done with the breakouts, no need to come back to the main session. You can just leave the meeting. And like I said, we'll be posting information from the meeting on both of the websites. So always can see results from different things. And while the main meeting was being recorded, your breakout sessions are not being recorded. Just want to let you know that. So with that, I am going to open the breakout rooms. Just want to do a couple little changes based on the number of attendees we currently have so that I have the rooms balanced. So just give me one quick second and then I'm going to open them up. Okay, I am going to open the rooms and then your facilitators will be able to answer any questions you have. Thank you all.